and welcome to the MAPS Canada webinar series, Examining the Psychedelic Renaissance, Season 2. My name is Reverend Shannon Smedella, and I'm your host for the series and a volunteer for MAPS Canada. I just wanted to say it's been a pleasure hosting both Season 1 and Season 2 of this series, and it's been even more of a pleasure getting to know all of these amazing speakers leading the way in the psychedelic renaissance. We are now in episode 8 of season 2, so halfway through of our web series, and we've got some amazing speakers on board. Each of these speakers and panels will be showing up to share important information and their take on the psychedelic renaissance. At MAPS Canada, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, we're on the forefront of conducting studies to develop psychedelics into safe and legal medical treatments since our formation. To conduct and publish scientific research and education supporting the beneficial use of psychedelic medicines, MAPS Canada relies on public donations and fundraising initiatives. The funds raised from this webinar series go to fund this research. So thank you for being here, because your investment does make a difference. To view the different studies that MAPS is currently working on, please see full details at mapscanada.org. You can also check out maps.org. And to make this webinar possible, we have many volunteers at MAPS Canada that help out. So I just wanted to take this time to say a huge thank you to them. We also have some amazing sponsors who've stepped up to support the webinar, and some have supplied some great perks for you to take advantage of. So if you haven't heard about these, you can access them at a link that we're going to pop in the chat, and we'll also put the password there, and you can check those out. So those are perks from our sponsors just for you. So thank you again to our sponsors for supplying those. So today we're going to start with a talk from Rabbi Zac Kamenetz. Very excited about that. After that, we will start our Q&A session. So make sure and put your questions down at the bottom and ask a question. Vote up your questions and let us know in the chat where you are tuning in from. So we have all over here. We have lots of different time zones: Santa Cruz, Berkeley, Nova Scotia, Horseshoe Bay, Vancouver, Calgary, Ontario, New York. So let us know where you're tuning in from, guys. Would be great to see where you're watching from tonight. So Rabbi Zac. Zac is a rabbi, community leader, and aspiring healer based in Berkeley, California. He holds an MA in Biblical Literature and Languages from UC Berkeley and the Graduate Theological Union, and received rabbinic ordination in 2012. A sought-after educator and qualified mindfulness-based stress reduction instructor, Zac's work has been centered on seeking answers to life's essential questions with the Jewish tradition and embodied spiritual practice. As the founder and CEO of Shefa, Zac is pioneering a movement to integrate safe and supported psychedelic use into the Jewish spiritual tradition, advocate for individuals and communities to heal individual and inherited trauma, and inspire a Jewish religious and creative renaissance in the 21st century. So today, our topic: what implications might the psychedelic renaissance have for religious communities and traditions, especially those without a reliable history of using entheogens in spiritual practice and development? What is the religious significance of incorporating psychedelic plants and compounds for a tradition where there has been very little before? Join Rabbi Zac Kamenetz, founder and CEO of Shefa, as he shares his process for preparing communities and individuals and revisioning theologies and practices by grounding psychedelic sacraments with Jewish spirituality. So very excited to meet Rabbi Zac. Let's welcome him to our crowdcast.
Nice to be here with you.
Hey, Zac, thanks so much for joining in. We're super excited to have you here, and really looking forward to your presentation and the Q&A today. So welcome, and I will give you the screen here and let you take it away.
Thank you so much. Thanks to MAPS Canada. Thanks to everyone who joined this evening. Again, my name is Rabbi Zac Kamenetz, CEO of Shefa, Connecting with Divine Flow. And you can learn more about me at my website, zackamenetz.com. And very soon, you can learn about the organization that we're building at shefaflow.org. I want to just make sure that my slideshow is ready to go. Shannon, how are we doing?
It looks wonderful.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. So this evening, I want to share with you part of the process that where, first of all, who am I and where am I coming from? Why am I invested in this question? How to prepare an ancient religious tradition for a psychedelic renaissance? And to give you a little bit of my current thinking about what are the questions, what are the opportunities, some of the challenges that not only a religious tradition like my own, modern Judaism, but as a map, as a guide or a model for other religious traditions, established religious traditions, who might want to consider doing something similar either now, before all of these plants and compounds are becoming more widely available, or after the fact. So we're doing it now, but hopefully we can join together with other religious leaders, religious traditions, and people of these various faiths. First of all, I want to acknowledge and honor and acknowledge where I am. I am in Berkeley, California, in the Bay Area, which is the land of the Ohlone people, specifically of the Chochenyo people. I want to let people know that part of our model for fundraising and the way that we give back to the community is that every dollar that we raise, we are giving a percentage of that money to what is called the Shumi tax, which goes directly into the Ohlone people and their educational, language, and cultural support. And this tax is one way of not only honoring that, but also continuing to support those people who still live here. And we're grateful for being allowed to live here now. So who am I? I was born in Southern California and grown up in Greensboro, North Carolina. I came from a Jewish family that I would say was marginally Reform, meaning that we went to synagogue regularly, but we had no conversations whatsoever about religion, the divine, what these practices could mean, the human spirit. I lived a fairly comfortable suburban life with mixed parentage, my Jewish mother and my Gentile non-Jewish stepfather. And I was having a great life up until when I was 15. When I was 15, I went on a free trip to Israel. My parents had seen that I was a little bit aimless. I didn't have a direction. I wasn't even sure if I wanted to go to college. So they sent me on this free trip. And I was about a month in when I was even struggling to be there. I didn't want to be there. I wanted to be back in my theater troupe. I wanted to be back with my girlfriend. I wanted to be with my friends. And one day, the trip, it was a travel study trip. We were at Tel Gezer, which if you know anything about ancient archaeology, you know that a tel is a mound of dirt that has been underneath. There are layers and layers of civilizations built one on top of another. So we're learning about ancient Israel. We're learning about the series of conquests and civilizations on that particular land leading up to Israelite conquest. And you could even see the archaeologists have dug into this land mound in such a way where you can see layer upon layer of these civilizations. This is Mameluke, this is Egyptian, this is Canaanite, this is Islamic, this is Israelite. And at that very moment, I had an unrehearsed and unexpected endogenous, meaning naturally occurring within me, mystical experience where I felt as though my mind was opening up to some new reality, some light, some presence, some awareness that I immediately identified as the divine, as God. I didn't know anything about God or the divine or what it meant to be religious, but it was something that was completely intuitive. It was something that I knew to be true and knew to be real. And from that very moment forward, I took on a religious lifestyle, started keeping Shabbat, the seventh day, Friday night to Saturday night. No commerce, no electronics, no phone, no driving. I started keeping kosher, separating between milk and meat, not eating pork or shellfish. And imagine being in a suburban setting in North Carolina, if you could, to two parents who had no connection to any of these things, and suddenly their son is Orthodox by all means. So this was a bit of a shock to me and to them. But from that point forward, I continued to learn more and more about Jewish heritage, Jewish culture, deeply wanted to study Torah in the original language of Hebrew, biblical Hebrew and Aramaic. And every step since that one moment at this archaeological dig has been a reaffirming step on this path. Now, it wasn't always as clear and obvious to me that I was walking with the divine, or that the divine was interested in the course of my life. My wife and I, several years ago, had suffered a long, agonizing process of actually being able to conceive and have a child through IVF. And at that time, when we were struggling and waiting for these things to happen, that natural feeling of being God intoxicated, it wore off. Perhaps through some psychosocial pressure, through some sort of feeling of alienation from my community or what I thought was supposed to happen in my life. And I actually sought out treatment. And you can see me here on the couch in a legal setting where I received 2 major doses of psilocybin. And one could not have been different from the other. You can read about my experience in an article I called I Was a Rabbinic Psychonaut. But from that period on, the integration of these 2 major psychedelic experiences, my first psychedelic experiences, one that was filled with light, that was filled with the presence of the divine, connections with my friends and family, gratitude, wonder, awe, and the second, completely dark, bleak, confusing, into the supracosmic void, in the language of Stanislav Grof. And finally understanding, after a few years of integration, that if I put them together, that for me, this was the full picture of a spiritual life. And of course, this is attested to in many more spiritual traditions, not just the Jewish one. But it had become embodied. It had become real for me, and not just words on a page that I knew. Presence and absence, fullness, emptiness, light, dark. But it was something that I saw as then my life, the affirmation of my life and my process, and some new step in my own spiritual maturity. It was also then that I started to research, well, what is going to happen when these compounds actually come into the general public? I'm a rabbi. I have a particular vocabulary. I have practices. I have a tradition. I have, an expert sense of these things. But what about any regular congregant? What about someone who has had very little exposure to Judaism, but suddenly are confronted with a spiritual truth, with something in their past that they could not even recognize on the conscious level, something in their far past, even before they were born? And how are they actually going to be able to ground that insight, the confrontations, the meeting point between them and the beyond, if they are gifted with such a visitation? How will they actually be able to work with that in integration? So I started reading as much psychedelic literature as I could. I started with Doors of Perception and have read everything as much as I could get my hands on up to this point. And 3 years later, I feel confident that this psychedelic renaissance is actually going to be a profound turning for religious communities, and the one that I help steward, the Jewish community, I feel like I have to have all of my energy and all of my effort into revitalizing Judaism, American Judaism to start, North American Judaism, and beyond, in order for us to actually survive this Renaissance. I don't know if we don't do the work now that we will be able to hold the promise, the potential, and the power of a psychedelic Renaissance without having done some pre-work, major pre-work. So that's what I'm here to do today. So I can break this into 4 different pieces. How to prepare for a psychedelic Renaissance in your ancient religious tradition. 4 steps. The first, in the beginning, these previous models that might actually exist in the tradition that you might not know about, but also their limitations. These are the names. A newish Jewish spiritual vocabulary for exploring expanded states, actually going back into the tradition and trying to reclaim some of the language that we have never applied explicitly to what we call expanded states, but might be available to us now that this is coming out in terms of psychedelic therapy and research. And they were called. What is the work that is ahead for the Jewish people? What are we being called to do? And finally, into the wilderness, integrating psychedelics and Jewish spirituality. So this is named after the first 4 books of the Hebrew Bible, and it serves as an important model. Where's the 5th book? The 5th book is yet to be written. So starting in the beginning. Maybe many of you, some of you have read Michael Pollan's book, now incredibly famous. He lives here in Berkeley. I bump into him in the farmer's market sometimes when he says in How to Change Your Mind on page 13, there is not one culture on earth that doesn't make use of certain plants as a matter of healing, habit, or spiritual practice. This is a major statement. He says there's only one that does not, and that is the Inuit culture, because these plants and substances can't grow where they live, but they probably use other things to change their consciousness. If that is so, then that also includes Jewish culture. That includes ancient Israelite culture. And when I read this, I was shocked because it was news to me. I had never learned in any of my yeshiva intensive training with Jewish texts and spirituality. I had never learned in rabbinical school about any of the use of these plants, any of these substances. And so if that is the case, even a rabbi does not know about these things. How do we uncover Israelite or Jewish entheogenic plant use if it's not apparent? I might have to plug in. I hear a dog barking in the distance. Well, there are many more people who have been working on this for much longer than I have been psychedelically involved. And it turns out that people have been actually, wrong earbuds, have been very excited about the promise of trying to uncover an entheogenic past between the pages, between the lines of the Hebrew Bible. If you have any understanding, any knowledge of the Bible itself, you know that there are references to plant material even from the very beginning in the Garden of Eden, where the first human beings, Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, have some encounter with some tree that has some plant or some fruit. The reason I say some plant or some fruit is because in the rabbinic tradition, in the Jewish tradition, it's not at all clear what that fruit is, even though it's depicted as an apple. In the rabbinic tradition and exegesis, it could be wheat, it could be grapes, it could be an etrog, a citron. And so we kind of leave it as an open question as to what that is, but there is some sense of a connection when these human beings eat this fruit or this vegetable or something, that they experience a new kind of reality, that their eyes are open and they start to see the world in a new way. Whether this is mythic or historic is another question for me. The mandrakes of Rachel and Leah, 2 sisters who are vying for the attention of their common husband, Jacob. The mandrakes, this plant, seems to be something that they are disputing about who gets what and when. And we know that mandrakes have these psychoactive properties, but it's not at all clear what their role is in this dispute between these sisters. One of the most famous ones, of course, is Moses at the burning bush. We'll talk a little bit about the speculative hypotheses that many, if not all, of the attestations of prophecy or encounter with a divine being are catalyzed by psychoactive plants. But there is this idea that the burning bush happens to be an acacia plant that happens to grow in this particular place. And when Moses sees or hears an angel and then hears the voice of God, the divine, it's only because of the inhalation of the DMT that happens to be in this acacia. We can talk then a little bit more about how we would break that down scientifically. But for now, just to know that that's something else. There are a lot of people do so much work with all of in the third and fourth book of the Hebrew Bible, Leviticus and Numbers. There is so much material about wine, anointing oil, incense, and showbread used in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle. And it just happens to be the major, I would say, the majority of what we know about plant material, because they are working within an environment that these are the materials that all of these things that are created for divine worship happen to be plant-based. And I just read an article somewhere from Double Blind Magazine that says that there are, and linked to another article, that there are 206 plant species that are identified in the Hebrew Bible alone. That, of course, does not include the New Testament or any of the church fathers. I'm just focusing right now on the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And we not only have this testament, as you will, this written record of Israelite Hebrew memory, myth, or political history, but we also have archaeology that is available to us. And something that just happened, I'm sure that many people are aware of, but in May of 2020, you can see the picture. This is a recreation of a site in Israel called Tel Aarad. You should look it up. It's another Tel, just like my Tel Gezer. This is another archaeological site that was buried or covered over in dirt. And when it was excavated in 1962, there was many things that were found, but there was also found, most importantly, a sanctuary site, a place for divine worship. You could see that this is a sanctuary site because of these two incense altars. The incense altars here, and even just the construction of this sanctuary, are incredibly similar to the directions that are given to Moses and his brother Aaron for the construction of the portable sanctuary tabernacle Mishkan in the desert, and then later in the Bible. So why it's interesting on its own is because there is a sanctuary that exists outside of Jerusalem. You might think that if you just read the Hebrew Bible straight, that there can only be a temple in Jerusalem on the Holy of Holy sites right now, covered by the Dome of the Rock, and that anything outside of it is not sanctioned. It might be that it was not sanctioned, but nevertheless, people didn't have back then did not have such a firm sense of there can only be one temple and only one holy site. And nevertheless, they've set one up here. The incense that was studied in 2020, the burn marks that you can see here in the two top squares, there's a residue that was found to be an admixture of cow dung and frankincense, with cannabinoid properties. That seems to suggest that people had been wondering about this, specifically because of the inclusion of a term called kane-bosem. Kane-bosem, cannabis. You could see how those two words could be derived. Kane-bosem being some sort of reed that is sweet smelling. Cannabis has its own linguistic derivative. Nevertheless, they did find traces of this cannabis, meaning to point to the fact that there is cannabis being burned slowly on an altar in a site where it is specifically for the worship of Yud-He, Vav-He, Adonai, Yahweh, the divine, the God of Israel. And this is very exciting because it comes to confirm some people who have been saying this for years and years. And it also then sparks questions, well, was that also then being used in the temple in Jerusalem? And is that actually what is being described in the Hebrew Bible? It's probable, but we need just this one paper came out in May, and we really need a lot more testing and a lot more debate about what it means. However, archaeochemists state that even the identification of these 206 plants in the Hebrew Bible that are sometimes then they are matched up with species of plants that we are aware of. The Latin genus and species names that have been ascribed to these biblical plants, but they have not done so with any hard analytical data. That means that you might say this mandrake is this particular species, or you might say that this plant material that is mentioned in the anointing oil is this thing that we are aware of that grows in the area. 20% at best. I just spoke with a new friend who's featured here, Brian Murarescu, whose book, The Immortality Key, just made it to number 10 on the New York Times bestseller list. He tells me that 20% at best of these plants have been identified from ancient Near Eastern and Greco-Roman cultures. They're only beginning to understand what these things actually are. And he's much more confident in there being entheogenic use in early Christianity, in the Eucharist, and also in Greco-Roman mystery religion. But he's not as confident with the biblical material. I said to him, I think that in some ways, in a lot of ways, religiously and spiritually, the Hebrew Bible is irretrievable. That it exists in memory, and that it was the rabbinic interpretation that actually then allowed the Hebrew Bible to continue to be a lived tradition. But so much of that era has not survived. Plant material doesn't survive unless it's burned and oxidized in carbon. Any sort of mushroom would never exist up until this point. We don't have any secondary resources or sources that can attest to there actually being direct entheogenic use, its preparation, and the process for it, that we know that was being used by many more people. Even the things about any of the wine or the anointing oil, the showbread, was used by a very small population. If it was only used by the priests inside the sanctuary, even if it was hotboxing the holy, that would only be used by one person. We don't see then a national use of these things, and it would then be hard to claim that Israelite religion was actually based on entheogenic use. So if even, and just one more point here, if we could identify these species, we really have no idea about their relative strength that we would find now and be able to identify, and then say, because of horticulture, to be able to say what is the actual strength, for example, of cannabosum, of cannabis that existed now, as opposed to right now in 2020, even 1990, before incredibly strong strains of cannabis being available to many more people. So I encourage you to continue to watch out for the work of Andrew Coe and Brian. This book just came out. Brian has been interviewed in a ton of places, and they are now hoping to found and start this Center for Archaeochemistry through Harvard. And he tells me that there are just so many things that have not been tested from the ancient world. And it's going to be this kind of meeting of science and spirituality to be able to actually, if we're using the terminology from science, that it should actually be supported and peer reviewed. versus something that is anecdotal. We see all this plant medicine all this plant material being used in the Hebrew Bible. We can talk about their admixtures and what that might do, but then having no direct evidence of the thing that it purports to do. We're missing something. So hopefully this Center for Archaeochemistry is going to be able to not only fill in some of the gaps, but also then to see if some of the speculative hypotheses actually bear out or not based on data. So I'd like to say, and I'm sorry if I hurt anybody's feelings, but claiming biblical entheogenic use is a claim of faith, while using the language of science to support a still speculative hypothesis. Maybe that's kind of the modern faith of the Hebrew Bible, to say that everyone everyone who encountered the divine only did so because of entheogenic use. And that might be an interesting interpretation. Yet, it does not provide us for a model of continuous use, and therefore we have to then start much more behind than other cultures who have been using entheogens for centuries and actually have some recorded usage from millennia ago. But what we do have more readily and more available to us are models of expanded states of consciousness that come out not only of the prophetic tradition, but of later traditions, Kabbalistic traditions dating as far back from the 1st and 2nd century. We have these texts that talk about people traveling to palaces, traveling to the angelic realms through powerful preparatory procedure. And also later Hasidic traditions from the 18th, 19th century into today of Eastern European Jewry, also many other mystical traditions that exist in the Jewry of the Middle East, North African traditions, and Arabs, Jews that live in Arab lands. There is an ongoing mystical tradition of trying to actually induce these states of consciousness that we then might be able to use and marry with modern entheogenic use. Another model, if we're trying to find out how do we actually approach this topic in a way that is consistent, it has actually some basis in the tradition itself, if one is interested in such a thing, I think is available in the current research and writing of Dr. Rick Strassman, and he calls it the Theo Neurological model. And he says in his book, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, which I highly recommend, just talked to him today, Theoneurology proposes that God communicates with humans prophetically using the brain as the physical agent of communication. It is a top-down model rather than a bottom-up neurotheological one. That is to say that the divine is real. Absolute consciousness exists, and it exists independent of plant medicine use. When we see the book of Isaiah or Ezekiel or Jeremiah, any of these people who have these just powerful visions, either of the future or of angelic beings or things that they can't even understand what they are, but try to describe nonetheless, that what is happening is DMT that is being created in the body is then the receptor for God's communication, God's speech, divine speech, and that is the way that we are actually linked. This is a fascinating, again, another hypothesis. But what it does is actually counters the previous model to say that you can only have any sort of divine communication or divine inspiration if you take plant medicine, right? In some ways, it doesn't go, I've seen hypotheses or writers who don't go all the way to say it only exists that way, but it usually excludes most understandings of these things being able to happen naturally for the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. What Strassman says is that all of these things are natural, but they are happening through a chemical reaction, but not one that is catalyzed by actually ingesting DMT, but DMT that can be produced within the body. So in some ways, it's kind of meeting. They're related and touching, but I still feel like they are they're opposing in some ways also. So if we kind of think about this in a graphic way, here's the Order of the Unified Heart from Leonard Cohen that is standing in for a Star of David. What we have then is, I think, two opposing models that could somehow be married together within the understanding of what the human brain is and does. We have above us the theological, transpersonal, and prophetic, right? The top down. But on the bottom, you have the Cartesian, Newtonian, and strict entheogenic use at the bottom, meaning that you only have divine inspiration when you take these plants or compounds, or that you don't need to take these things. You could experience divine communication through taking plant medicine, but it's much more likely that you have to work on your prophetic abilities in order to access divine language or divine wisdom through the DMT that you yourself produce. So which one is it? I mean, this is, I don't necessarily need to pick one or two. I always, if I'm presented with two models, I always want to ask, like, well, what's the third? But this is something that I think is fascinating, and one that not only that Judaism has to confront. This is a question of Jewish theology. Jewish theology usually doesn't have to wonder about plant medicine, but if we're entering into a new turning of Jewish spirituality, then we have to contend with it. Where does the connection between the human being and the divine voice actually come from? And this is actually a debate that we find also in the work of Stanislav Grof and others, in terms of there being a transpersonal model of consciousness and existence, and the Cartesian Newtonian materialistic one that could very well easily say that the divine realm is not a reality, but merely one that is produced by the mind, and it might be important and valuable, but doesn't exist on its own, versus the one that says it's the only thing that exists, and it is something that can be accessed usually through higher orders of consciousness. Ooh. Okay, so now that we've kind of got our two models that we're going to then try to find what is the third model, we then have to say, like, okay, well, what are some other ways of accessing divine knowledge, divine presence that can impact a person's life in the most profound way? And I say here that we have to create a new model then of psychedelic exploration in expanded states that balances these two. And luckily, I think that third way is going to be actually borrowing or mining the Jewish mystical tradition, also known as Kabbalah, which means to receive, the reception of something, into a transpersonal theology and integrative therapeutic model. Not only are we trying to construct a new map of reality based on our Jewish texts with some knowledge of transpersonal psychology, but also in a way that we know that it's going to impact people's lives for the better, for the good, for the healing of trauma, painful emotions and memories, and actually for the betterment of well people also, not only for people that are in therapeutic need. So what is Kabbalah at its essence? You could go to the Wikipedia page. What is Kabbalah? I know some things. I don't know some other things. You can find it on the internet, but I wanted to get to something like the core of its lived experience. And I couldn't find anything better than this paragraph from Rabbi Arthur Green. He right now is one of the founders, the dean of Hebrew College, which is an academic organization. It's an academic institution. They also train non-denominational rabbis. He's probably one of the most important Jewish theologians of the 20th and 21st century. And he says that Kabbalah teaches that there is a secret unity of all being, hidden within the multiplicity and diversity of life as we experience it. I mean, just that one sentence, I think you could spend a whole lifetime just kind of turning over, but I will go on. God and universe are related not primarily as creator and creature, which sound as though they are separate from one another, but as deep structure and surface. God lies within or behind the facade of all that is. In order to discover God, or the real meaning or the essential oneness of being, not to lock us into God language for people for whom that does not work or that it's not available to them, we need to turn inward, to look more deeply at ourselves and the world around us. Scratch the surface of reality and you will discover God. Or you can put in real meaning or the essential oneness of being. Art Green would say that's perfectly fine. The path to God and more is thus more like peeling off the layers of an onion than climbing a ladder to the sky. The journey of the seeker to God is only a metaphoric one. We, in fact, discover oneness of being by staying right here, paying as close attention as we can to the present in which we live. But if we are to speak of journeys, the mystic offers us a journey inward, an inner opening rather than a vertical ascent. So we could debate some of the points that Arthur Green, who is also well known, he's a theological humanist. But regardless of where the divine exists, whether it's up and out there or whether it's deep within, the journey of peeling back the layer, we have to go inward to go outward, upward or downward. I will hold my opinion about. But that, I think, is a very powerful model for what Jewish mysticism can offer everybody, not only Jewish people, but for all people. He's actually just has released a book more about thinking about Judaism as a world religion. I don't remember the title of that book, but this is kind of furthering this thesis that he's been working with for the past 10 years or so. So, based on what Rabbi Green has said and some other things, we then need to, if we're going to create this new Jewish spiritual vocabulary, we have to then reconstruct the way in which we think about our entire reality in order for the people who are the Jewish people and their fellow travelers, when they're on the couch or when they're in a group setting with in a psychedelic state, an expanded state of consciousness, what is the reality in which we offer that they are actually inhabiting? Many psychedelic researchers, many theorists, they will produce a map of reality and consciousness based on Eastern traditions. But we have not yet seen, and hopefully, I'm talking out some of my ideas right now. We have not yet seen anything like this in Judaism, and hopefully that this is a first step. So what is the reality in which we exist? We need a new map. We can base this on some core spiritual teachings that are found in the Jewish tradition. For example, probably the most central one, at least to my life, is the idea of tzimtzum, of retraction, of withdrawal, contraction, even like a womb, wherein a world exists with and without the divine. It's said in several core texts in the Jewish mystical tradition that long before the reality that we know, that we live in, that there was only the divine presence. And for whatever reason, that divine presence decided, had a will to have something other than it, that it had to contract, it had to restrict itself into a place where it did not exist in order to create a world or a reality that we could actually inhabit, we ourselves in this realm. And therefore, we are presented with a paradox. We live in a world where the divine is real and exists, and yet does not exist in order for us to exist. It's that kind of paradoxical thinking, the presence and absence, with and without, that then becomes the model for our entire existence. It doesn't only exist in the cosmos, but it also then exists in my heart. It exists within my reality, the way I think about my relationships or my relationship to my pain or my body. If Tzimtzum is one of the maps of consciousness itself, then it also exists in me. And then what might that offer me if I am not only going through a therapeutic process, but also then want to increase my joy, my well-being, my happiness in life through psychedelic use. Another one is focusing on the letters as being the letters of the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew language, the Hebrew alphabet itself, being the building blocks of the universe. And in some ways then to think that it is a communicative universe. We see in the first chapter of the book of Genesis that it is divine speech that actually creates reality. Let there be, may there be this. It's not existing, it's not self-producing, but is an active speech that creates a world or many worlds. And if that is the case, then if that's the mythic case, I'm not going to make a truth claim to know that that's like how the universe actually was created, but that I look upon my lived reality in my life, my body, the objects in front of me and the people around me as being part of divine speech, right? That there is everything that is communicating to me, regardless of what it is, communicating something about the divine in it. And then it is the responsibility or the role of the person, the journeyer, to be able to not only think of the world that way, the world that they gaze upon every day, the experiences that they feel within their mind states or their body sensations, even in their breath, that then might offer more potential for feeling at home in the universe that is made of speech. There's also another model, the world as God, the world living inside divinity, that in some ways, like kind of heightening the sense of panentheism, meaning that everything that exists is the divine and that there's no separation between my existence and absolute existence. This is attested to, of course, in several spiritual traditions. But if we actually brought that into Jewish religion as it is lived by the majority of people that claim Judaism culturally, spiritually, or religiously, what would that do to actually shift the ways in which we think of our traditions, we think of our rituals, our sacred occasions, and holidays, and the way that we think about our relationships between ourselves, our fellow Jewish people, and the larger global community? It will change. And then finally, tasting the tree of life, accessing undifferentiated consciousness for a moment. To be able to have a kind of special consciousness that is not just like waking consciousness, but to go back to that mythic moment of Adam and Eve, where they eat the fruit and then or the plant, and then are transported into a new reality where they see themselves as different from each other. They see themselves as different from the tree, the garden, the divine. Could we actually practice that transition from living inside divinity, but then also our own individuation? This is not, the goal is not to erase the individual, but to have them feel as though they can inhabit both a world in which there's only divinity, and a world in which there is an individual that has its own dignity, it has its own will and consciousness, and that there is some balancing between those two things. Can we actually create practices to help people transition between these states of consciousness? So not only just maps of reality, but also maps of being. As I mentioned, the individuation of the human soul, pursuing the path of self. Once I actually recognize that my spirit, my own consciousness, is an individuation of consciousness itself, absolute consciousness, how then do I affirm self, the the I in Hebrew, it's the Anochi, right? The I-ness of me, when we know that from biblical language and biblical Hebrew, and also all of these episodes in which there is divine speech and communication, that Anochi is most often associated with the divine, the God of Israel. I, Anochi Hashem, I am the Lord, your God. Right? There is this mirroring of the Anochi of the divine and the Anochi of the self, the person, the human being. And there then seem to be a mirror for one another, where if I can understand more fully my own self, my own situation, my own reality, that in some ways opens me up to new dimensions of divine reality and divine selfhood. Reaching beyond knowing, understanding also that there are aspects of our lives, there are aspects of reality that even if while we are trying to gain deeper knowledge and deeper wisdom and deeper understanding through these states of consciousness, that it's attested to in many spiritual masters, that the purpose of all of this practice, the purpose of all of this speculation, of all of this meditation, of all of this energy is ultimately to not know, to understand the limits of knowledge. And at the end of the day, to be able to say, I know all of this and yet I do not know, right? That there is this humility, even when being able to access divine reality or divine consciousness, to know that I'm only experiencing it through a limited lens, and that to free oneself of the mirage of knowing anything actually might be the highest spiritual plane of maturation. And finally, that souls of chaos, right? It is said that even before the time of the creation, when reality came into being, heaven and earth, light and darkness, ocean and land, animal, mineral, plant, that there was chaos, that there was warp and woof, that there was void and wastelessness. And it is the void and wastelessness. In Hebrew, tohu vavohu, which even in the Hebrew itself, tohu vavohu, you can see that it doesn't have anything to hold on to. It's o and u. That this is what all of reality was based upon. Not necessarily a perfect, flawless creation, but that there is a murmuring deep, that there's even in one rabbinic legend, this is as if a king built a palace upon a trash heap. That we know that at any moment, chaos, evil, pain can burst forth from the natural order and enter into our lives, our political reality, into our lived physical lives. But even on the level of consciousness, of psychology, that there are particular people who continue to live with this inner churning, that things are not settled, that they see the world even in its perfection, even if you accept some sense of that divinity or absolute consciousness, that nevertheless, that there is something chaotic, that there is always a brokenness that lives with them. And how can we then actually raise that profile, this chaotic soul, who feels doubt, who feels pain, who sees the pain of others more than the perfection or the divine order in our world, but to make for difference, right? This is not to see the world through Hashem-covered, Hashem-tinted glasses, right? Just that everything is fine because it's all divine reality, but that it is broken down the middle, right? Even in that tzimtzum, even in that contraction, that there is something that is broken, that there is something that is not quite right. And so this offers a different model than what we sometimes see with particular spiritual traditions. And this one should then be raised up. We have, of course, in our tradition, lots of models of accompaniment. If we're going to talk about people going on journeys and not doing it solo, but actually having guides, we have models from teacher and student relationships, which are professed even from Mount Sinai, the divine as the teacher and Moses as the student. Moses becoming the teacher and the people becoming the students of Torah throughout the generations. The divine and the self, in even the friend and the companion, not only just the hierarchical relationship of someone who has the knowledge and someone who's seeking it, but also some sort of mutuality, much more like trip sitting than some sort of trained guide. We have an incredible collection of traditions that attest to preparation in terms of set and setting. Right? These things exist currently in terms of how does your space look before you are having synagogue services? How does your home look right before lighting candles on Shabbat? There are all of these ways in which we think about setting as being a vessel for the divine, right? It's said also that there is no blessing without a vessel to receive it. That's one beautiful spiritual teaching from our tradition. And then to take that seriously in terms of psychedelic therapy or psychedelic journeying, what then is needed in order to create a vessel for that flow, for that gift of blessing or grace that might only happen with deep intention in preparation. The body, the space, clearing the mind. It is said that the sages of old would wait 1 hour in meditation even before they began their morning prayers. How might we create traditions to create that kind of heavy weightedness on the mind, or even the clarity then of mind, in order to prepare for these states of consciousness. And then finally, entering the presence. We have so many models of when someone is actually inside an expanded state of consciousness. Moses, the high priest, the Baal Shem Tov, right? The founder of the Hasidic movement, and many other sages. How do they actually then, how do they move from one state of consciousness to another? It's delicate, it can be painful, it can be terrifying, it can be blissful. But if we can actually then retrieve those teachings, retrieve those stories, and then use them as models, we then have this profound way of helping Jewish people through the diversity, the range of experiences that they will have while under the influence of these plants and compounds. For example, here's just one liturgical poem that if we sang it, if we learned it, if we spoke about it, if we related it to our lives, it might change the way in which we think about whatever we're going to encounter. Here is in the language of the journeyer or the worshiper. This is a liturgical poem called Anim Zmirot, which was written, I think, in the 9th century in the Rhineland by Judah the Pious. And he says, I'll just skip to a middle line. Each time I speak of your glory, my heart longs for your love. Therefore, I will speak about you, about your glories. Your name I shall honor with love songs. Skipping down, I'll tell of your glory, though I have never seen you. I'll give people images for you and names for you, but I don't even know you, right? There's that knowing and not knowing. There's the intimacy, and yet there's the absence. By the hand of your prophets, or through private counsel with your worshipers, you provided images of the beauty and the glory of your power. Skipping down just a line, they imagine you, but not as you really are. They tried to describe you according to your deeds. But there are these glimmers, there are these flashes of light and knowledge that can happen in these expanded states, and yet they don't tell the full story. So if we can open up people to the possibility of not only an encounter with the beyond, but also its limitations through our own traditions, our prayers and our practices, that they might then find some grounding in a reality, in a tradition that already exists, even though it has not been entheogenic explicitly, but that it is profound and waiting for them. Of course, at some other point, they're just so numerous. Actually, what happens when one is inhabiting one of these expanded states of consciousness, either through psychedelics or some other means, deep or heavy breathing, putting oneself in a stress position, meditation or visualization. We have so many Kabbalistic and Hasidic models for exploring these divine realms of consciousness. I highly recommend looking at Jonathan Garb's shamanic voyage, the shamanic voyage in modern Kabbalah. He goes through probably from the 16th century until now, even using the word shamanic, which I think is an important move. But just what was available to the Jewish mystics of the past in order to explore realms beyond their everyday lived reality. And finally, I like to say that Judaism is ultimately one of the ultimate integration curriculum of all time. That there's one rabbinic question that says, after all of the fire and all of the smoke and all of the sounds of Mount Sinai, when the divine was giving or teaching the people the Torah, one of the next scenes that happens right after that is giving laws about what happens when you move into your land and how you should actually leave your land fallow on the seventh year in order for a number of reasons. And the question is, well, what does that have anything to do with the power of the Mount Sinai revelation? And for me, that feels exactly like spiritual or psychedelic integration. You have this powerful experience that you then ground in mundane activity, ecstasy and laundry. And here, Judaism offers many models for integration. Specifically, new relationships with time. You're never more than a week away from the ability to think about and experience time in a different way. And in Judaism, we have Shabbat, the seventh day, which offers many, like a 25-hour mindfulness retreat, but many more occasions during the year. We're moving out of a month of having no holidays after having, our major high holidays, no holidays, and moving toward two holidays. One is, which is fairly new in the Jewish calendar for all of Israel, which is Sigd, an Ethiopian holiday, which celebrates revelation of the Torah to the Jewish people, but also just going back to what we talked about before about Moses's revelation at the burning bush, which has not existed in Jewish culture up until this point in the Ethiopian community, and Hanukkah, right? This idea that there is light that is waiting to be uncovered, or Haganuz, that there is a hidden light beyond the light that exists in our world, that has existed from time immemorial, from primordial reality, that by the simple act of lighting a candle that can exist with all of its wisdom and with all of its knowledge that is available for the person who's ready to receive it. And many more practices. Hitbodedut, self-isolation, where one enters into relational contemplation with the divine through a speech act, and daily embodied practice through prayer and holy acts, Torah, tefillah, mitzvot, right? The daily language of Jewish observance then becomes an occasion to actually ground any insight that one has had in this expanded state into at least 613 ways of making these encounters and insights real and living in a person's life. And then finally, things that exist beyond Jewish law and Jewish practice, such as song, singing wordless melodies, dancing, chanting, and even screaming. These could become opportunities to, again, bring these insights into one's daily life. Okay, and then finally the work, and I'm just going to finish up kind of quickly because I want to make sure that I have time for questions. I think what is the work that exists or that needs to exist? First of all, we have to rekindle our mystical heart. over the past 250 years at least, not just for Judaism, but for all, I'd say most, if not all, Western traditions. There has been this process of rationalization. I'm going to plug in my computer just a second. Great. The Age of the Enlightenment did away with a number of mystical traditions for the Jewish people for the purpose of their own political safety and survival. Jews of Western European origin who had mystical practices with them on the daily, when they were told that they could become citizens of these enlightened societies, they were also asked, but demanded, that some of the trappings of their traditions that were untenable to their Protestant neighbors be removed. And so we see then this sharp turn away from mystical embodied religious culture into something that is much more proper and has the decorum of its Christian analogs at the time. And that has continued then as a heritage for many Jewish traditions, that the rational and the reasonable has won out over the ecstatic and the mystical. How do we then actually bring this kind of mystical awareness back into the experience of many Jews who just don't even know about this? You know, if you look at the Pew study of 2010, that the majority of American Jews don't even consider themselves Jews by religion. They think of, what are the highest values of Jewish life and culture? The humor or remembering the Holocaust, not to be able to touch the core of their own existence through their spiritual traditions and connection with spiritual teachers. Not to say that our spiritual traditions and spiritual teachers haven't wounded a great many people, but that these things have been, as I like to say, bred or beaten out of them. And I think it's time for a reassessment of what the focus of Jewish life has been, and to reinvigorate it through incorporating these mystical teachings and traditions. We have to prepare our own guides. As grateful as I am for my guides and for all of the work that has been done from the 60s until now, in order to understand, what are these therapeutic models, what are these guide models, I have found them to be largely based in Christian or Vedantic mystic models, and not represented of Jewish religion, of Jewish spirituality. And I think it's then time for us to represent our own spiritual heritage. I find scant evidence that any of the major researchers in psychedelic theology or theory have a strong working knowledge of Jewish tradition. That's obvious in some ways because most of these texts are in a language that they don't speak, or even if they're translated, they're highly self-referential and complicated, sometimes more complex than some of our Eastern counterparts. And yet, Jewish people who encounter these things, they should be represented and cared for by people who understand their concerns on a deep and personal level. I like to say, whenever I go to a new therapist, I don't like spending the first 4 sessions like talking about what is Shabbat. I just like to be able to know, okay, what Shabbat is like, and now we can actually talk about the thing that's happening during Shabbat. So all cultures should be able to be represented in these spaces, whether queer, people of color, and certainly Jewish concerns are the same. And healing from our deepest wounds. Here, I'll just skip forward. That I just on a call today, speaking to Jewish people who had never even heard of Katzenik, Yechiel Denur, who's pictured on the left-hand side, He was a survivor of Auschwitz. He writes about his experience in this book on the right called Shiviti, a Vision, where he actually is here testifying at the Eichmann trial, that doomed Eichmann to execution for being the architect of the final solution and Auschwitz. And he was one of the first Jewish people who underwent, and you can see in this middle picture, although it's not him, psychedelic therapy, LSD therapy, in the 70s by this Dutch psychologist Jan Bastians. And there's a great article in Haaretz that just came out a few months ago about Jan Bastians and his work with concentration camp survivors. There are still survivors, first generation, and second and third generation survivors who are still carrying the wounds of those who were either in camps or displaced, or watched their families be massacred, and will continue to carry them as long as they are not working in the deepest way possible. So not only for rekindling the mystical heart, but about human suffering that exists in the form of Holocaust trauma, but also 2,000 years of trauma, intergenerational epigenetic trauma from pogroms, from anti-Semitism, that we could speculate about what are the actual effects of these things for 6 million and more people around the globe. But I would like to then at least stop the process of passing on this trauma and actually begin to work on it and see what is actually available to Jewish people when they have healed from these wounds. And I'll say what's the last thing, bringing the Messiah. And I don't want to be accused of being psychedelic messianic, but there is this passage from, I mentioned the Baal Shem Tov, Yisrael Shem Tov, who was the founder of the Hasidic movement, this ecstatic movement in Eastern Europe, 18th and 19th century. And he has a vision of actually ascending his own consciousness. He calls it an aliyas haneshama, like his soul actually goes out and up and meets the messianic soul. And he recounts this encounter with this messianic being in a letter to one of his family members. And he says, I asked the Mashiach, I asked the Messiah, when will the Master come? When will you, the Messiah, come and end this suffering? And the Messiah answered, by this you shall know. In the time when your teaching will become public and revealed in the world, your well springs will burst forth to their farthest extremes. That which I have taught you and you have comprehended, and they shall also be able to perform unifications and elevations as you. And then all of the klipot, all of these externalities, all these harsh realities will cease to exist, and there shall be a time of good and salvation. So if Judaism is in its core messianic, meaning that there is a vision of an end to a time of suffering, a time of goodwill and salvation, the Baal Shem Tov says that it is only when the Jewish people, the majority of Jewish people, all people, are able to access these realms of consciousness that are beyond everyday consciousness. And I don't think that we actually have the time to be working with endogenous states, but actually must integrate psychedelics in order to have this goodwill and salvation come speedily in our day. God knows that we need it, just looking outside. There's much more to talk about. I want to have time for questions. You can contact me at zackamenetz.com if you have any other questions. Look out for shefaflow.org and offerings from the organization Shefa that I've just founded. I want to thank you for your time and thank MAPS Canada again for having me present some of these ideas that I'm still working out, and have just a couple minutes for some questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Zach. That was absolutely amazing. All right, there we go. We're back. All right, you guys can hear me okay? You can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. So you have about 9 questions here, and we'll try to get a few of them in. But just wanted to say, amazing presentation. Thank you for all of that wonderful knowledge. So we have one here. We'll start with the most votes. What resources would you suggest to people who are interested in learning about intersections of psychedelics and spirituality?
Intersections of psychedelics and spirituality. I do think going into the classics is a great step. So starting with Aldous Huxley, the earliest writings of Tim Leary and Richard Alpert, most of the early works of, or actually the later works of Stanislav Grof, after he's kind of worked out all of the LSD psychotherapy stuff, the Cosmic Game. Now you can read a lot of it in The Way of the Psychonaut. There's, even though it's not necessarily a book about psychedelics, I think just even those kind of expanded states of consciousness, Wild Grace is, I think that's the name of the book. I have to just look up real quick. By Mirabai Starr, you'll look it up later. Wild Grace, maybe it's called something else. Fierce Grace. Sorry to not have the name right on me. And trying to think of one more, psychedelics and spirituality. Oh yes, Sacred Knowledge by Bill Richards is a fantastic book on this, and I think that's all that comes to mind right now. That's general. Okay. That's general psychedelics and spirituality. Oh wait, a couple more. Entheogens and the Future of Religion, which is edited by Robert Forte, and Entheogens as spiritual. I lent someone the book, and I will never see it again. Entheogens as paths for spiritual development. There's something like that. It's a collection of essays. It's also very good.
Okay, wonderful. What we'll do is we'll have someone come back and rewatch this and get all of those, and we're going to send out an email newsletter to everyone who's attending the webinar. So we'll go in and we'll get the names for all of those and the links for them and send them out. Thanks so much for all of that. Next question we have here is from James. Why do you think so many religions deny their history and relationship with entheogens?
It's a great question. I think, that first of all, it requires establishment. I think, like Brian says, that most of these things have existed speculatively. So, for example, Christian Eucharist, and there are these either paintings of early Christians and mushrooms, or there are these stained glass structures with pictures of mushrooms, or there are people who will speculate about air god, etc. With regard to Judaism, or even was there anything to do with Muhammad's revelation and any sort of psychedelic substance. But the fact is that if these things are not established by some sort of credible means, that they remain in speculation. And I don't think that that I think there are some people who will say that this is just a continued ongoing way to centralize power. Because if these things are known to be able to produce spiritual experiences or visions, then the people who are leaders or prophets or priests, then they lose that power. I really can't say one way or the other. I don't want to make like an affirmative statement, but I think if people were given, religious leaders were given more than just, don't you see in the text, it says right here that people were eating mushrooms before they saw the body of Christ. but more like archaeochemistry, then I wonder if actually people's minds might change and they actually might be more open to it. For Judaism, for example, there's a paper out there that was written in the 70s called LSD, A Jewish View. And it's very clear that Jewish people, or at least this one Orthodox rabbi, has no idea about what LSD does or is, but he has heard of all of the terrible things that happen when you take LSD through the process of stigmatization, all of this false information that existed at the time, and that he then says one cannot have an authentic spiritual experience if they are taking a substance. They didn't have Roland Griffiths and Bill Richards and all of the other amazing researchers out there that are actually showing people data, the safe use, what are the actual risks versus the perceived toxicity versus the actual toxicity. So let's give people a chance. Let's give people a chance to actually get familiar with data, be good models, be good psychedelic stewards, and then lead by example, but also showing them the data that's coming out of these research institutions.
Absolutely. So we have a question here from Connor, and he says, Rabbi Arthur Green used psychedelics from 1965 to 1971-72. Reb Zalman used psychedelics for the first time in 1962 and until late in life. Both were foundational to Jewish renewal. Today, students of Rabbi Green at Hebrew College are displaying interest in incorporating entheogens into Jewish practice. We know that Green and Zalman both used psychedelics while forming Jewish renewal. And here comes the question. How will a broader use of psychedelics affect Jewish renewal in the next generations of these Jewish expressions?
Wow. Connor, hi, Connor. It is a great question. How is this going to happen? Or how what is going to happen is a question that I can't answer. But if we look back, right, let's look back at the movements that, if we could trace them back, and one could argue against this, but to say that the movements of whole earth consciousness, of feminism, of civil rights, of a sense of shared humanity and care for the environment and the world, for the real and lived political struggles of various communities of humans on the world. Just the artistry that came out of this, of the first or the second psychedelic wave. Imagine if that actually was contained within religious traditions itself, where people were looking for other ways to create that vessel to receive that blessing, and they found it in many other ways. But if we directed that back toward our own community, right? Versus, I like to say, like, the Goldsteins and the Alperts and the Jews of the generation that could have been the great spiritual rabbis. They found other places to be great spiritual teachers. But if we actually had them coming back to the traditions that were part of their lives already, can't imagine where Judaism would be as a force for good in the world now, a force for creativity, a force for healing. So let's just imagine that once we actually have the models for which Jewish people can actually then own their spiritual and mystical traditions, have these voyages and these journeys, and then return with all of that insight, creativity, and energy to then use them as tools for the betterment of our world, the betterment of society, for the flourishing of art, music, and culture, then I can't imagine other than just amazing things. But it's yet to be seen. I have high hopes. I hope nothing bad, but only good. But we'll see about that too.
Let's see if we can get in one or two, few less questions here. This is from Johnny. He says, some religious spiritual traditions are clear about prohibiting intoxicants of any kind, like Buddhism. Would these traditions need to be excluded out of respect, or is there any leeway or particular approach where one can introduce the potential spiritual benefits of a psychedelic experience while at the same time fully respecting the tenets of the person's belief system?
Well, thank you for the question. As someone who is not a Buddhist and someone who knows things about Buddhism but doesn't live within a Buddhist community or as a representative of Buddhist theology and teaching in any way, I don't feel comfortable necessarily answering for them. But if I could use my own direct experience as a model, that there may well be a segment of the society of Jewish culture that will never accept Judaism as being having any religious significance, as any of the insights or the new formulations of theology or the new Kabbalistic models and trees, whatever is the outcome of this. They might never accept that. They might say, that was something which was induced through a substance. It wasn't produced endogenously. Just like the article that I referenced from the 70s, there are people still today that say that, there is no true spiritual experience on a psychoactive drug. And so then we're going to find ourselves having psychedelic Buddhism and non-psychedelic Buddhism. And at least from my perspective, as there being 70 faces of the Torah, as there being, multiple faces of the divine, just like in that liturgical poem, right? That, that I saw you as a stern judge. I saw you as a powerful warrior, but I know that couldn't encapsulate the entire you. That, all of these things will be the turning of another face of reality. And even if there might be disputes about what is real and what is true and what is valid and what is not, for us to be able to zoom back in and to be able to see this all as the unfolding of the diversity of reality and lived human experience.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I have another question here for you that isn't on Crowdcast. It's about when you talk about the mystical experience. So the mystical experience that you had mentioned the wear off time. And I believe this mystical experience was without any kind of psychedelics. So with or without psychedelic use, there is that generally that wear off time. So we enter back into society, getting dragged back into the world, wrapped up in drama, wrapped up in all other things that are encompassed in living in a human body on this earth. How can we still be in this world, but not of it? So how can we be here, be in bodies, but also remember that, still be in that ecstatic state of, during the experience that was mystical, whether it be through psychedelic use or not?
Great question. I think that hold on just a second. I think there is something that is offered in what I would call Hasidic psychology, which is, if you have a mythic story, if you have a remembered past, and those, that's an ecstatic story. That's Arjuna. That is Buddha being enlightened underneath the tree. That is the people of Israel that are walking through the Red Sea that is split before them. That is the body of Christ descending into death and then being reborn. All of those moments, those profound spiritual moments of all of our traditions, can become integrated into our lives as realities that are being lived by us now. So every moment of my life, I am leaving Egypt as a freed slave. Every moment of my life, I am being taught the Torah from Mount Sinai again. Every moment of my life, I am feeling the cataclysm of tzimtzum of reality being broken up into presence and absence and reconstituted, right? That is a profound spiritual practice. And then to, not just to, we can talk about postmodern theologies, but to get from, something that is imagined, but is something that is real, and living as if without the wink of our own self-awareness.
Thank you so much for that. So it looks like we are almost at time here. Are there any final words that you wanted to leave with us before we depart here?
I want to also just take a moment to acknowledge and thank Bob Jesse and the Council on Spiritual Practices, which was like a very early inspiration for the work that I knew was possible for me, that I think is possible for my tradition and all traditions. I think just a couple years ago, he gave a fantastic talk about the findings of psychedelic research and the reconstruction of religion. I highly recommend that people who are interested in the relationship between psychedelics and religion watch that, because for so much of it, it is about healing from the wounds that religion itself has inflicted upon us, or have other religious things or religious people have inflicted upon us, that then how to make religion available for us as a healing positive source, and not one of destruction and pain.
Absolutely. And I loved what you said about healing the mystical heart. I completely agree with that. And just, bringing the mystical experience back into life altogether, not just first into religion, but also into everyone's heart and everyone's world. So it was an amazing talk today. Thank you so much for all of the models and all of your knowledge, and for being here with us and sharing everything you did with us today. We truly appreciate you here at MAPS, and we hope that you'll come back again and share some more wisdom with us. And we'll also be putting your link for your website in the chat right away here, and then sending it out on the newsletter with all of the great links and books and whatnot that you gave as well. Thank you so much for being here with us, Zac.
All right. Stay safe.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you. Be well.
So to close off the webinar here, we just wanted to say a super special thank you to everyone for tuning in, supporting the series, the speakers, and of course, this important research. Thank you again to all of the sponsors. And again, if you haven't checked out that perks page, we will post the link in the chat for you one more time, again, with the password, which is psilocybin. And you can check out the perks from all of our sponsors. Thank you again to Zac for joining us and for the amazing knowledge and the amazing presentation. And just a reminder that we do send out an email newsletter to all of the attendees of the webinar on Thursdays. So make sure and check your email on Thursdays, because that has information about the perks, and it'll also have all of Zac's links in there that he shared today, as well as all of the books. And next week we'll have Zoe Helena with us, and that is the 17th. And I think that's it for today. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning again to Examining the Psychedelic Renaissance Season 2. Have a great night, and make sure and be kind. Good night, everyone.